This is Oradour-sur-Glane, France. Nobody lives here now. Down this road, on a summer day in 1944, they came. They stayed only a few hours. When they had gone, the community which had lived for 1,000 years was dead. The day the soldiers came, the people were gathered together. The men were taken to garages and barns. The women and children were led down this road, and they were driven into this church. Here they heard the firing as their men were shot. Then they were killed too. A few weeks later, many of those who had done the killing were themselves dead in battle. 2 o'clock, Saturday, the 10th of June 1944. The commander of the detachment, Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, stopped at the Champ de Foire fairground or marketplace and called for the mayor. There was to be an identity check and that all the inhabitants were to assemble immediately on the fairground itself. Everyone was to attend, from the youngest baby to the oldest citizen. No one was to be excused, not even the sick. Madame André Binet, the head teacher of the girls' school, who was at home ill with a high temperature, was not given time to dress, and made her way to the assembly with a dressing gown over her nightclothes. Clement Broussardier, who had come into the village for a haircut that day, was seated in the barber's chair, with a white blouse over his shoulders, when he was ordered to go to the fairground as he was. Much later, he was to recall that the time was exactly 2 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. When he tried to get his bicycle, a soldier took it from him, saying in French, "You won't be needing it anymore." Roger was just under 8 years old and small for his age. A mischievous, red-haired enfant terrible, who was well known in the village as a daredevil. He described the events of the day as beginning with bullets flying through the walls of the school, and their teacher getting all the pupils to lie on the floor. As their situation was becoming worse, Roger, his sisters Jean, 13, and Pierrette, 11, ran hand in hand to the infant school, a short distance further into the village. When they arrived, they found all the children there in tears. A German soldier entered, brandishing a gun and shouting, "Raus! Out!" Roger's parents had made a plan that if ever they were to be threatened by Germans again, they would run and hide in the woods behind the cemetery. When the order came for all the children to go to the fairground, Roger tried to persuade his sisters to go with him, but they would not. They cried they wanted Mum. Roger decided to escape alone, and did so whilst the teacher was talking to the soldier. He ducked into an empty playroom, through an open window, and out the rear of the school. In running out of the school and climbing over the fence at the rear, he lost a shoe, but started towards the woods behind the cemetery. At the corner of the road, leading to the cemetery itself, he was spotted by one of the SS troopers, who shot at him. The boy fell as though dead, and did not move even when the soldier kicked him in the kidneys. Later, after the man left, Roger started out again for the woods, but was seen by another soldier, who did not attempt to shoot, but told him to run away. 2:30, Saturday the 10th of June 1944. No one was ever actually asked to produce his or her papers. Maurice Compain the baker was becoming anxious as he was in the midst of baking and needed to attend to his ovens before the bread spoiled. He asked a nearby soldier if he could go and attend to his bakery, and was given the assurance, "Don't worry about it, we will see to it." 3 o'clock, Saturday the 10th of June 1944. By now the assembly of the village's population was more or less complete. At this point, the soldiers began to separate the men from the women and children. During this process, it would be better if the women and children were to leave the fairground and wait in the church. It is recalled that the sound of the children's wooden shoes mingled with the heavy tramp of the soldiers' boots on the cobblestones sounded like the beat of a mournful drum. As they walked to the church, the children were encouraged to sing. The men were now ordered to sit in 3 rows facing the north wall of the fairground. As they waited, Joseph Bergman said to his friend Marcel Darthot, "Look out, they're going to kill us." Darthot did not believe him and asked what made him think such a thing. "Well, I heard," was all he said. 4 o'clock, Saturday the 10th of June 1944. The church. The following testament comes from Madame Marguerite Roufanche, the only survivor from the church. At about 2 p.m. on the 10th of June 1944, German soldiers burst into my home and ordered me to go to the fairground together with my husband, son, 2 daughters and a granddaughter. A number from the village were already assembled, and men and women were flocking in from all directions. They were followed by the school children, who arrived separately. The Germans divided us into 2 groups, women and children on one side and men on the other. The first group that I was in was taken under armed guard to the church. It consisted of all the women from the village, especially mothers, who entered the house of God carrying their babies in their arms or pushing them in their prams. All the school children were there as well. We must have numbered several hundred. Crammed inside the church, we waited in growing anxiety to see what would happen next. Around 4 o'clock, a few soldiers, about 20 years old, brought into the nave a large box from which hung strings which trailed to the ground. When the trailing strings were lit, the device suddenly exploded with a loud bang and gave off a thick, black, suffocating smoke. Women and children, half choking and screaming in terror, rushed to those parts of the church where the air was still breathable. It was thus that the door to the sacristy was broken down under the irresistible pressure of a terrified crowd. I followed them and sat down on a step. My daughter joined me. The Germans saw that people had escaped into the room and cold-bloodedly shot down everyone who was hiding there. My daughter was killed by a shot fired from outside. I owe my life to my closing my eyes and feigning death. Firing burst out in the church from the entrance door, and then straw, firewood and chairs were thrown in a heap onto the bodies lying on the flagstones. I had escaped the slaughter unwounded, and took advantage of a cloud of smoke to hide behind the altar. In that part of the church, there were 3 windows. I went to the middle one, the biggest, and with the aid of the stool used to light the candles, tried to reach it. I don't know how, but my strength was multiplied. I heaved myself up to it as best I could, and threw myself out of the opening that was offered to me by the already shattered window. I fell about 10 feet. When I looked up, I saw that I'd been followed by a woman who was holding out her baby to me from the window. She fell down next to me, but the Germans, alerted by the child's cries, fired at us. The woman and the child were killed. I myself was wounded as I made my way to a nearby garden. I hid among some rows of peas and waited in terror for help to arrive. But that was not going to be until the following day. 5 o'clock, Saturday the 10th of June 1944. In the village there was an elderly bedridden man, Pierre Giroux, who could not be moved. Later, when he was found, he seemed to have been burned to death in his bed. It was not possible to recognise him from the remains in the gutted house. Around this time, a group of cyclists, on a day out from Limoges, were apprehended by the soldiers when they arrived in Oradour. They were all shot in front of the church before it was set on fire. The group of bodies were gathered together and thrown down the well. Many people lived outside the village, but within earshot, and they came to look at what was going on. Mostly, they were parents, frantic with worry for their children and reckless as to their own safety. Madame Demery managed to reach the boys' school and found it deserted, but with the children's satchels still in place on their pegs. 6 o'clock, Saturday the 10th of June 1944. From around 6 o'clock, the church began to burn. It was then that the main destruction of the village began as the troops entered, looted and burning every building, bar and house. Also, around this time, all those other people who had hidden in their houses and gardens began to escape out of the village. 7 o'clock, Saturday the 10th of June 1944. The St. Junien tram, which routinely stopped at Oradour, arrived. The soldiers boarded it and examined the identity papers of all its passengers. The 20 passengers whose papers showed that they were from Oradour or from the immediate district surrounding it were made to get off. The terrified passengers were escorted to a field, and after some discussion between them, the soldiers decided to let the 20 frightened French people go. One of the passengers, a young woman, was given a bicycle by one of the soldiers. 1 minute people were being killed in the most horrific manner, and the next, a young woman thoughtfully helped on her way. There was an atmosphere of almost surreal, knife-edged balance about this. Only a tiny push and all those people would surely have been killed. Sunday, the 11th of June 1944. Throughout the night, anxious and increasingly desperate people had begun to gather on the outskirts of the village, many of them parents whose children had not returned from school. Others were villagers who, for one reason or another, had been absent on the Saturday, but now wished to return home. All the people who entered Oradour that day commented on the terrible stench of burned flesh pervading the whole village. The domestic animals, especially the dogs, who had their tails between their legs and who whined as they sniffed around the ruins, trying to find their owners. Monday the 12th of June to Thursday the 29th of June 1944. On Monday morning, the SS soldiers returned to Oradour in a futile attempt to tidy up some of the mess. The soldiers dug 2 main burial pits, but these were half-hearted attempts at burying the dead. A man's body was buried so carelessly that his hand was seen sticking up into the air. The smell of decay in the hot June sun was overwhelming. Later, the French men and women exhumed all the bodies that the soldiers had attempted to bury and gathered the remains from the church and other locations, as well as those personal effects that they could find. The French authorities were able to publish a full list of the dead, which came to a total of 642 persons. Only 52 of these were formally identified, with death certificates being issued. The rest, so badly burned as to be unrecognisable, were officially declared missing. No one was ever tried or punished for the massacre of the citizens of Oradour.